Part 1. The Girl in the Veil. The sound of bare feet dragging across cold marble. Year 89 of the Common Era. You are standing in a Roman atrium pressed against the wall with 6 other witnesses. You cannot move. You cannot speak. Your only purpose tonight is to watch. In the center of the room, an 18-year-old girl in a bridal veil stands frozen. Her hands are shaking. In front of her, something draped in dark cloth nearly 4 feet tall, its shape concealed beneath heavy fabric. Behind her, a physician with a leather bag of instruments. Beside him, an elderly woman whose grip on the girl's arm tells you everything you need to know. There is no escape from this room. The girl's mother wept this morning while braiding her hair. Her final words were a warning. Do not resist. Whatever they require of you tonight, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. Now the girl reaches out. Her fingers close around the dark cloth. She pulls it back, and what stands beneath, carved from dark wood polished smooth by 1,000 brides before her, makes her face go white. But here is what she does not know yet. The statue is just the beginning. After that comes the physician's examination. After that comes the witness consummation. After that comes the documentation that will mark her body as legally transferred property. And every Roman bride for 1,000 years went through this. Every Roman mother prepared her daughter with the same whispered warning. And when Christianity conquered Rome, they erased it so completely that almost no one today knows it ever happened. Stay with me, because what you are about to discover has been buried for 2,000 years. And by the end, you will understand exactly why they buried it. This is the truth about Roman wedding nights and the ritual they tried to erase from history. If this story grips you, drop a like. It takes a second and helps us pull more voices out of the silence. Now let us go back, not to the atrium, not yet. Let us go back 3 years before that night to the moment when Flavia Tirsa's fate was decided in a room she was never allowed to enter. Her father's name was Gaius Tursus, a minor Roman official low enough in the hierarchy that his salary barely covered the upkeep of a modest house near the Quirinal Hill, but high enough that his daughter carried a name worth something in the marriage market. Gaius had spent most of his career managing grain distribution records for the city of Rome. He understood ledgers. He understood transactions. He understood that everything of value required proper documentation, including his daughter. He had watched other fathers in his position handle this transaction poorly. Some were too eager accepting the first offer, undervaluing their daughters, losing leverage they could never recover. Others were too cautious, waiting too long, watching their daughters age past the window of maximum value, settling eventually for matches far beneath what early negotiations might have secured. One colleague, a clerk in the Treasury office, had delayed his daughter's marriage until she was 19. By then, the best offers had dried up. He ended up marrying her to a freedman, a former slave who had made money in the leather trade. The girl's status dropped 3 social tiers in a single afternoon. The clerk never recovered from the humiliation. Gaius intended to be neither reckless nor slow. He would approach this the way he approached everything in his professional life, with documentation, with patience, with a clear understanding of market conditions. Flavia was 15 when Gaius began looking for a husband for her. In Rome, this was not unusual. Girls could be legally married at 12, though most families of any standing waited until 14 or 15, when a girl's body had developed enough to suggest she could survive childbirth. Gaius was practical about this. He had seen too many families destroyed by marrying daughters too young, losing them in labor, losing the grandchildren, losing the dowry, losing everything. So he waited, and while he waited, he calculated. A Roman father evaluating his daughter for marriage considered the same factors a Roman merchant considered when pricing a shipment of grain: quality, condition, market demand, potential yield. Flavia was healthy, her teeth were good. She had wide hips, which physicians associated with safe deliveries. She had no visible deformities, no history of illness in the family, no scandalous relatives whose reputation might lower her value. And she was a virgin. In Rome, this was not merely a preference. It was a legal requirement for first marriages among respectable families. A girl who had been touched by another man was damaged goods. Her value plummeted. Her family's honor suffered. The contracts would reflect the reduction if contracts could be negotiated at all. This was not metaphor. Roman law treated women as property with absolute precision. The legal framework was called patria potestas, the power of the father. Under this system, a Roman father held total authority over every member of his household, including his wife, his children, his slaves, and his freedmen. He could sell his children into slavery. He could expose newborn infants to die on hillsides if they were unwanted. In the earliest periods of Roman law, he held the right of life and death over every person under his roof. By the time Flavia was born, these powers had been softened somewhat. A father could no longer kill his adult children without legal consequences. But the fundamental principle remained untouched. A daughter was her father's property until she became her husband's property. The mechanism of transfer was marriage. And marriage in Rome was a contract, not a contract like modern marriage, which at least pretends to be a partnership between equals. Roman marriage contracts read like commercial agreements because that is exactly what they were. They specified the assets being transferred. They documented the condition of the principal asset, which was the bride. They established terms for dissolution and the return of invested capital. They named witnesses who could testify to the legitimacy of the transaction. The Romans were not hiding what they were doing. They were not disguising exploitation behind pretty language. They were being precise. They were applying the same legal machinery that made their civilization the most organized and efficient the world had ever seen. The system that could build a road from Britain to Syria, that could supply 1 million people in a single city with fresh water and grain, that could administer an empire spanning 3 continents, that same system was applied to marriage with the same engineering precision. And the system worked. Roman marriages produced legitimate heirs with documented lineage. Inheritance disputes were minimized because property chains were clear. Family alliances were stable because the terms were explicit and enforceable. The entire structure of Roman society, its stability, its durability, its capacity to function across vast distances and diverse populations depended on marriage functioning as a reliable, verifiable legal mechanism. The cost of this efficiency was borne entirely by the women it processed. Gaius found his buyer 3 years into the search. His name was Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant, 43 years old, wealthy enough to matter in Roman commercial circles, connected enough to be useful to a minor official, looking to advance his family's position. Marcus had been married once before. His first wife had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, taking the child with her. He needed an heir. He needed a young wife healthy enough to provide one. Flavia met Marcus exactly 3 times before the wedding day. The first meeting was a formal introduction at a dinner arranged by a mutual associate. Marcus had examined her the way Gaius expected him to, the way any buyer examines merchandise. He looked at her face, her posture, her hands, the way she carried herself. He asked her father about her health. He asked about her education. He did not ask Flavia a single question. The second meeting took place at a temple festival chaperoned by both families. Marcus spoke to Flavia briefly. He asked if she could manage a household. She said yes. He asked if she understood her duties as a wife. She said she had been instructed. He nodded. That was sufficient. The third meeting was the signing of the betrothal contract. Flavia was present but did not speak. Her father and Marcus negotiated the terms. The dowry was substantial, nearly everything Gaius had saved from 20 years of government service. In return, Marcus agreed to certain provisions for Flavia's maintenance. If Marcus died first, Flavia would retain a portion of the estate. If the marriage was dissolved for reasons other than Flavia's misconduct, the dowry would be partially returned. These were standard terms, businesslike, precise, the kind of language Gaius used every day in his grain distribution ledgers. Quantities in, quantities out. Value transferred, value received. The commodity being traded happened to be his daughter, but the logic was identical. Flavia sat through this meeting with her hands folded in her lap. She understood fragments of what was being discussed. She knew the dowry amount was significant because she had overheard her parents arguing about it weeks earlier. Her mother had wanted to hold back a portion of private reserve that Flavia could access if the marriage went badly. Her father had refused. The full amount was necessary to secure Marcus. Holding anything back would signal doubt about the bride's value, and doubt once introduced into a negotiation was nearly impossible to remove. Flavia watched Marcus sign the contract. His hand was steady. He did not look at her. He looked at the wax seal her father pressed into the document, verifying the amount, confirming the terms. When it was done, Marcus stood, nodded to Gaius, and left without a word to Flavia. She was now legally betrothed. In Rome, betrothal carried nearly the force of marriage itself. Breaking a betrothal without cause could result in legal penalties, financial claims, and social disgrace. Flavia was committed. The machinery had begun to move, and it would not stop until it had processed her completely. Love was never discussed. Love was not relevant to the transaction. Roman poets wrote about love certainly. Catullus burned for Lesbia. Ovid cataloged the arts of seduction. But these were entertainments, diversions for men with leisure. Real marriage among families with property and position operated on a different set of principles entirely. Marriage was an economic alliance, a merger of families documented and witnessed, like the sale of land or livestock. And Flavia was the livestock. The wedding day arrived in early autumn of the year 89 of the Common Era. Flavia woke before dawn. Slaves had been preparing the house since midnight. Her mother Cornelia came to her room carrying the ceremonial items that tradition demanded. The bridal veil, called the flammeum, was the color of a candle flame. Deep saffron yellow, so vivid it seemed to glow in the lamplight. Cornelia draped it over her daughter's shoulders and began the process of arranging Flavia's hair. This was not a simple matter. Roman bridal hair followed a precise formula passed down through generations. 6 braids, no more, no fewer. Each braid bound with ribbons of white wool. The hair parted with the tip of a spear, a tradition so ancient that no one remembered its original meaning. Though scholars later speculated, it symbolized the subjugation of the bride, the piercing of her former identity. Cornelia worked in silence. Her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this for other brides, who understood every step, who knew what each element represented. But as she wound the 6th braid and secured it with the final ribbon, something broke. She began to cry, not gentle tears, deep shuddering sobs that she tried to muffle with her hand pressed against her mouth. Her whole body shook. The braid she had just completed trembled with the force of it. Flavia was alarmed. She had never seen her mother lose composure like this. Cornelia was a Roman matron of the old school, composed and dignified under every circumstance. But now she wept like a woman at a funeral. "Mother, what is wrong?" Cornelia could not answer for several moments. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, a whisper that Flavia had to lean close to hear. "Do not resist. Whatever they require of you tonight, do not resist. It only makes everything worse." Flavia did not understand. She thought she knew what wedding nights involved. She had heard older women speak in careful euphemisms about a wife's duties. She understood the basic mechanics of what would happen between her and Marcus. She expected pain. She expected awkwardness. She expected to endure something unpleasant in the service of producing the heirs her husband required. She had not prepared for what was actually waiting. But Cornelia said nothing more. She wiped her eyes, straightened her back, and resumed the mask of composure that Roman society demanded of its women. Whatever memory had broken through, whatever experience from her own wedding night had surfaced in that moment, she pushed it back down into the silence where it had lived for 20 years. She never explained. She never would. The ceremony at the temple proceeded according to ancient custom. Priests sacrificed a sheep and examined its entrails. The liver was smooth, the color good, the gods approved. Gaius signed the marriage contracts using the formula that made the union legally binding under Roman law. And then Flavia spoke the words, "Ubi tu Gaius ego Gaia." Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia. The phrase was so old that its original meaning had been debated for centuries. But what it accomplished was clear. In speaking those words, Flavia ceased to exist as a legal person. Her identity was subsumed into her husband's. She was no longer the daughter of Gaius Tursus. She was the wife of Marcus Petronius Rufus. His property, his responsibility, his to do with as law and custom permitted. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. One moment she was one man's property. The next moment she was another's. The words were the mechanism. The witnesses were the verification. The documents were the record. But the ceremony at the temple was only the legal beginning. The public beginning. The part of the wedding that Rome allowed the world to see. What waited at the end of the torch-lit procession in the house she had never entered, in the room where witnesses were already assembled, that was where the true transformation would occur. The procession began at sunset. Flavia walked through the streets of Rome, surrounded by a crowd of well-wishers, family members, hired musicians, and curious strangers. 3 young boys led the way carrying torches of whitethorn wood. The flames cast wild shadows on the walls of buildings as the procession wound through narrow streets. And the crowd sang, not hymns, not blessings, not songs of joy or hope or tenderness. The crowd sang obscene songs, Fescennine verses they were called in ancient tradition, supposedly meant to ward off evil spirits through crude humor. The verses described in graphic, explicit detail what would happen to Flavia that night, what Marcus would do to her, how she would respond, what sounds she would make. Young men in the crowd shouted suggestions that made Flavia's face burn beneath the veil. Old women cackled and threw walnuts at her dress, a fertility blessing that felt like assault. Children ran alongside, chanting words they barely understood, words their parents laughed at, words that reduced everything Flavia was about to experience to a public joke. The procession passed through the forum where merchants were closing their stalls for the evening. A butcher paused with a cleaver in his hand to watch the bride go by. A wine seller raised his cup in mock salute. Two soldiers leaning against a column made comments loud enough for Flavia to hear and crude enough to make the nearest women gasp with laughter. This was Rome. This was how Rome celebrated the transfer of a woman from one man to another, with public humiliation disguised as tradition, with sexual violence transformed into comedy, with the annihilation of a young woman's dignity presented as entertainment for people who would forget her name by morning. Her mother walked beside her through all of it, silent, jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. That look on Cornelia's face, the look of a woman who has already seen what waits at the end of this road and can do nothing to prevent her daughter from walking, it would stay with Flavia for the rest of her life. The procession reached the house of Marcus Petronius Rufus as the last light disappeared from the sky. The doorway was decorated with white wool and garlands of greenery. Two torches burned on either side, marking this as a place where a marriage would be consummated according to law. Marcus stood waiting in the doorway. Behind him, Flavia could see figures moving in the lamplight. Too many figures. Far too many for what she had imagined would be a private moment between a bride and her groom. Marcus lifted her over the threshold. Tradition said it was unlucky for a bride to stumble entering her new home. But the gesture carried an older meaning, the memory from an era when marriage was not negotiation, but seizure, when women were carried into their husbands' houses, whether they wished to enter or not. The lifting was a civilized echo of something savage. The door closed behind her, and Flavia finally saw what was waiting in the atrium. Count them with her. An elderly woman in formal robes, the pronuba, whose role was to oversee everything that would happen tonight and provide testimony if the marriage was ever legally challenged. A priest of uncertain affiliation, his face half-shadowed by lamplight. Three female slaves carrying basins of water and clean cloths. An older man with a leather bag at his feet, medical instruments visible through its opening. And in the corner of the room, draped in dark fabric that concealed its shape, a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. Too many people, too many eyes, too many witnesses for what Flavia had imagined would be private. The pronuba stepped forward and took Flavia's hands. Her grip was firm, almost restraining, as though she had learned through long experience that this was the moment when brides tried to flee. Welcome to your husband's home. The sacred rites must now be completed. Part 2, the 9 witnesses. There were 9 people in the room on Flavia Tirsa's wedding night. Each one had a function prescribed by law or custom. Each one was there to ensure that a transaction worth thousands of sesterces was completed according to proper procedure. Flavia was the only person in that room who had no right to leave. Let me tell you about each of them, because understanding who was in that room and why reveals more about Roman civilization than 1,000 marble statues or triumphal arches ever could. The pronuba's name was Servilia. She was 60 years old, a respected matron from a senatorial family that had fallen on modest times. She had outlived 2 husbands and raised 4 children to adulthood. Her reputation was spotless. Her testimony in matters of marriage had been accepted by Roman courts on more than 200 occasions. This was her function. In Roman legal practice, certain transactions required witnesses of unimpeachable character: the sale of significant property, the manumission of slaves, the adoption of heirs, and the consummation of marriage. The pronuba was not merely a ceremonial figure. She was a legal officer. Her eyes were the eyes of Rome itself, watching to ensure that what was done in this room could never be disputed. Servilia had seen 200 brides stand where Flavia now stood. She had seen them tremble. She had seen them weep. She had seen them stand rigid with terror, or limp with resignation, or wild-eyed with confusion, because no one had told them what was coming. She had seen every possible reaction a young woman could have to the moment when she realized what Roman marriage actually required. And Servilia had guided every one of them through it, firmly, methodically, without sentiment, because sentiment was not her role. Verification was her role, and she performed it with the same precision that a surveyor brings to mapping the boundaries of newly purchased land. The physician's name was Quintus Elias. He was 54 years old, trained in the Greek medical tradition at Ephesus, and maintained a practice among the merchant families of Rome's Aventine district. His specialty was obstetrics and the health of women, which in Roman medical practice meant he was frequently called upon to perform examinations that had as much to do with law as with medicine. Quintus had already examined Flavia once, 3 weeks before the wedding. That initial examination had been conducted at her father's house in the presence of Cornelia and a female attendant. Its purpose was to establish what Roman legal language called the baseline condition of the bride, to document in medical terms that could withstand legal scrutiny that the merchandise being transferred was intact. He had performed this examination with the clinical detachment his profession required. He had noted Flavia's physical development, her general health, and the specific anatomical details that confirmed her virginity. He had recorded his findings on a wax tablet and sealed it with his professional mark. This document would become part of the marriage's legal record, filed alongside the contracts, the dowry agreements, and the testimony of witnesses. Now Quintus waited with his instruments for the second examination, and the third, because the system required redundancy. The system required verification at every stage. The system was thorough in ways that made perfect sense within Roman legal logic, and that horrify us precisely because that logic treated a young woman's body as a piece of real estate requiring survey. Servilia guided Flavia toward the draped figure in the corner. Flavia's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The pronuba's hand remained on her arm, firm and guiding, allowing no retreat. The 6 witnesses along the wall stood motionless. The physician waited. The slaves held their basins. The lamplight flickered, sending shadows dancing across the walls. "You must greet Mutunus Tutunus," the pronuba said. Her voice was formal, ritualistic, carrying the weight of 1,000 repetitions. "You must ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Flavia reached out with trembling hands and pulled back the dark cloth. What stood beneath was carved from dark wood hardened by age, polished to a deep shine by generations of use. The surface was smooth where countless hands had touched it, where countless bodies had been pressed against it. It was shaped with anatomical precision into the form of a phallus, not a small amulet like the ones children wore around their necks to ward off the evil eye. Not a garden ornament placed among flowers for luck. This figure was sized deliberately proportioned, carefully designed for a specific purpose that became clear as the pronuba began explaining what Flavia must do. Mutunu Tutunus was Rome's god of fertility and sexual initiation. His name survives in scattered references across Roman literature, always mentioned briefly, always with visible discomfort even by the Romans themselves. The deity belonged to that class of gods that Rome acknowledged were necessary but preferred not to discuss in polite company. We know this ritual existed because multiple ancient sources confirm it, writing from different centuries, different perspectives, different motivations, and arriving at the same basic description. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity conquered pagan Rome, described the practice with barely contained outrage. Roman brides, he wrote, were required to sit upon the wooden fastenum of Mutunus Tutunus as a sacred duty before consummation with their husbands. The ritual was performed in the presence of witnesses. Augustine was a hostile source, a Christian bishop determined to condemn everything about paganism. But hostile sources are still sources, and his description matches what we find elsewhere. Lactantius, another church father, writing somewhat earlier, called the practice so shameful that even naming it pollutes the speaker. This is a curious reaction if the ritual involved merely touching a statue briefly, as some modern historians have suggested. You do not refuse to name something that is merely symbolic. Arnobius provided this most detailed account describing brides made to straddle the divine emblem, their new husbands looking on. His language implied physical contact that went beyond symbolic gesture. And Varro, writing centuries before Christianity, with no theological agenda whatsoever, mentioned Mutunus Tutunus as a deity to whom brides were presented, using language that implied physical interaction without explicitly describing its nature. Varro was a scholar cataloging Roman religious practices. He had no reason to invent or exaggerate. He was simply recording what everyone in Rome already knew. The stated purpose was divine blessing, fertility for the marriage, healthy children, a fruitful union. Romans believed that sexual initiation under divine auspices would ensure the gods' favor for the couple's reproductive future. This explanation was accepted without question for centuries because it fit neatly into Rome's broader religious framework. Romans invoked divine blessing for everything. You prayed before planting crops. You sacrificed before battles. You consulted augurs before signing contracts. Seeking divine favor for a marriage was entirely consistent with how Romans understood the relationship between human action and divine will. But look closer at the mechanics of this particular blessing and the explanation begins to crumble. If the purpose was purely religious, why did the ritual require physical contact rather than a simple prayer or offering? Rome had hundreds of deities associated with fertility. Juno Lucina blessed pregnancies. Venus governed desire. Ceres protected harvests, and by extension, the fertility of all living things. Prayers to any of these gods could have served the stated purpose without requiring a bride to mount a wooden statue. If the purpose was symbolic, why did Lactantius, a man who spent his career writing about pagan foolishness, refuse to describe the details? Because they were too shameful to name. Lactantius had no problem describing other Roman rituals he considered absurd. He mocked augury. He ridiculed animal sacrifice. He condemned the gladiatorial games in vivid detail. But this particular practice was so extreme that merely describing it crossed a line even this professional critic of paganism would not cross. And if the purpose was benign, why did the bride's husband watch? The practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have acknowledged to themselves, was something far more calculated. Preparation, conditioning, the systematic breaking down of resistance before the real consummation began. The demonstration of absolute submission before witnesses who would testify that the bride had complied with every requirement. The transformation of a young woman from a person with the capacity to refuse into a wife who understood that refusal was not possible. Servilia positioned Flavia before the statue. Her hands were professional, guiding, adjusting, demonstrating the required posture. Her voice was steady, instructional, as though she were teaching a new slave to properly fold linen rather than directing an 18-year-old girl through a ritual that would change her relationship with her own body forever. The witnesses watched. Marcus watched from across the room, his face unreadable in the lamplight. The physician waited with his instruments. The slaves held basins of water that would be needed afterward. And Flavia understood finally what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been preparing her for. What being a Roman wife actually required. She could refuse, theoretically. Roman law did not explicitly compel a bride to complete the ritual, but refusal carried consequences that made it functionally impossible. Refusal meant disgrace for her entire family, nullification of the contracts her father had spent 3 years negotiating, return to her father's house as damaged goods, a woman who had been publicly presented for marriage and found deficient. No respectable man would make an offer for her afterward. She would live out her life as a dependent in her father's household, a burden, a source of shame, a living reminder of failure. It meant everything she had been taught about duty, honor, and a woman's place in the Roman order would be proven false, and she would be proven worthless. Flavia did not refuse. Think about that for a moment. An 18-year-old girl surrounded by strangers in a room she entered for the first time tonight, facing something she never imagined, and her only real choice was obedience or ruin. The system had been designed so that refusal was technically possible but practically catastrophic. This was not an accident. This was architecture. The designers of Roman marriage law understood that a system requiring literal physical force to compel participation would be recognized as what it was. But a system that offered a theoretical choice while making one option so devastating that no rational person would choose it, that system could present itself as voluntary. Every woman chose to comply. Therefore, every woman consented. Therefore, no woman was forced. The logic was flawless, the cruelty was invisible, and the system could describe itself with perfect sincerity as based on tradition, honor, and religious devotion. I am curious what is going through your mind right now. Drop a comment. I read every single one. No one ever told us what she felt. No Roman woman of her class left a record of this moment. The silence on this subject is so complete that it can only be understood as systemic. Women did not write about their wedding nights because the culture that demanded these rituals also denied women the tools and the audience for recording their experiences. The men who wrote Rome's histories did not describe these rituals because they seemed as natural and unremarkable as breathing. Everyone knew. No one spoke of it. After the ritual with the statue, the slaves stepped forward. They washed Flavia in basins of scented water carefully, methodically. This washing had religious significance. It purified the bride after her encounter with the god. The sacred and the profane had to be separated before the human consummation could proceed. But it was also practical, a preparation, a transition from one ordeal to the next. The physician Quintus Aelius stepped forward. This examination was not optional. Before any wedding involving significant property, a Roman bride underwent verification. Her virginity confirmed her physical state, documented in terms that could withstand legal scrutiny. The documentation became part of the marriage's permanent record, filed alongside contracts and financial agreements as evidence of the bride's condition at the time of transfer. Roman medical texts describe the techniques used with clinical precision that leaves no ambiguity about what was involved. The examination was thorough. It was intimate in ways that modern medical ethics would never permit without explicit informed consent. And it was performed before witnesses because in Rome, anything worth documenting was worth witnessing. Quintus had already examined Flavia once 3 weeks before the wedding, establishing the baseline. Now, after the ritual with Mutunus Tutunus, he performed a second examination. This one served a different purpose. It verified that the ritual had been properly completed. It confirmed that Flavia's physical state was consistent with what the earlier examination had established. It ensured that no tampering had occurred, no substitution, no fraud. Think about what this means. The system required a physician to examine the same woman twice before and after a ritual to create a chain of documentation proving that the property being transferred met the advertised specifications at every stage. This was not medicine. This was quality control. This was the same logic that drove a grain inspector to weigh a shipment at the dock and again at the warehouse to ensure nothing had been lost or replaced in transit. Roman legal manuals from the period describe the documentation requirements for property transfers of various kinds. For land, you needed a surveyor's report, boundary markers witnessed by neighbors, and a magistrate's seal. For slaves, you needed a bill of sale noting physical condition, origin skills, and any defects. For livestock, you needed weight, age, breeding history, and a veterinarian's assessment. For a bride, you needed verification of virginity, documentation of physical health, confirmation of fertility, potential, and witness completion of consummation. The parallels were not accidental. They were structural. Roman law treated all these transfers as fundamentally the same kind of transaction. The category of the property changed. The logic of verification did not. Cyrenus of Ephesus, the most celebrated gynecologist of the Roman world, wrote extensively about the methods physicians used to assess women's bodies. His texts, which survived because later physicians found them medically useful rather than historically interesting, describe examination procedures with a precision that leaves nothing to imagination. The instruments in Quintus's leather bag, the specula and probes that Roman archaeologists have recovered from medical sites across the empire, were designed for exactly this kind of assessment. The commodity being inspected happened to be a human being, but the logic was identical. All of this occurred in the presence of witnesses. Witnesses whose testimony might be required if any aspect of the marriage was ever legally challenged. If Marcus claimed the bride was not a virgin, if Gaius claimed the consummation never occurred, if either family sought to dissolve the marriage on grounds of non-compliance with ritual requirements, the witnesses were insurance. Their eyes were the guarantee that the transaction had been executed according to law. What strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions of these practices is not just the invasiveness, it is the casualness. Romans did not view these rituals as traumatic. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined and observed and documented were no more relevant than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures. After the examination, Flavia was led to the bedchamber prepared for consummation. The room was decorated according to tradition, garlands of flowers, lamps filled with scented oil. The marriage bed was positioned with care, angled for visibility from the doorway, because the doorway would remain open throughout the night. This was not an oversight. This was design. The consummation of a Roman marriage was a semi-public event, witnessed and verified like every other stage of the property transfer. The pronuba servilia took her position near the entrance, where she could observe everything that occurred on the marriage bed while maintaining the formal dignity her role required. Slaves who would be needed afterwards stood ready in the corridor outside. Their duties included providing fresh linens, water for washing, and any other assistance the pronuba might require in the course of the night. Marcus entered the bedchamber. And here is a detail that the original story preserved, a detail that most people overlook because it complicates the simple narrative of predator and victim. Marcus seemed nervous. He glanced toward the pronuba with something like embarrassment before approaching the bed. He paused. He adjusted his garments without purpose. He looked at Flavia and then looked away. This was not the behavior of a confident man exercising his rights over conquered territory. This was the behavior of a man who understood that what was about to happen was also being done to him. Not in the same way, not with the same stakes, not with anything approaching the same violation. But Marcus too was performing under observation. Marcus too was being evaluated by witnesses who would testify about his performance, his adequacy, his ability to consummate the marriage in ways that satisfied legal requirements. The system did not only grind women into compliance, it also turned men into instruments, performers in a ritual they had not designed, executors of requirements handed down through centuries of legal tradition. Marcus had not invented this system, he had inherited it, and the system expected him to perform. His first wife, the one who died in childbirth 7 years earlier, had been his first marriage as well. He had stood in the same room or one very like it as a younger man. He knew what the pronuba expected. He knew what the witnesses were watching for. He knew that failure to consummate or consummate adequately could result in legal challenges that would cost him the dowry, the alliance with Gaius's family, and his reputation among the merchant families of Rome. Performance anxiety is not a modern invention. Roman men felt it too. The difference was that Roman men performed under the observation of professionals whose job was to evaluate the performance and testify about it in court if necessary. Marcus took a breath. He straightened his shoulders. He walked toward the bed where his 18-year-old bride waited, a girl he had met 3 times whose name he sometimes still confused with his first wife's. He was not a monster. He was a man doing what the system required, and the system required everything. Servilia's voice cut through the silence, formal, ritualistic, carrying the authority of Roman law and the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed this union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife. What followed lasted several hours. Servilia observed throughout, occasionally providing instruction when she determined that legal requirements had not yet been satisfied. The door remained open. Sounds carried into the corridor where slaves waited with their basins and their linens. Everything that happened in that bedchamber was documented not in writing but in the memory of a woman whose professional reputation depended on the accuracy of her testimony. The slaves in the corridor had their own duties. When Servilia called for water, they brought it. When she required fresh linens, they provided them. When morning came, they would dispose of the bedding that served as physical evidence of consummation. In households where the marriage involved significant wealth, these linens were sometimes preserved, stored as documentation the way a modern business might preserve a signed contract. The 3 female slaves had been selected for this duty because they were women, because Roman custom held that male slaves should not witness the consummation, and because their status as property meant their observations could never be used as legal testimony. They saw everything and their seeing counted for nothing. They were the invisible witnesses present, but legally non-existent. In a room full of people performing legally defined roles, the slaves were the only ones who saw the truth without a frame around it, without the justification of law or religion or duty. They simply saw a girl endure what the system required, and they cleaned up afterward. At dawn, the physician returned for the final examination. This one confirmed that consummation had occurred, that Flavia was now physically changed in ways that marked her transition from virgin property to marital property, from asset awaiting transfer to asset successfully transferred. The examination was documented. Servilia provided formal testimony regarding what she had witnessed throughout the night. The legal transformation was complete. Flavia Tirsa was now a Roman wife. But before we leave this room, before we follow Flavia into the 40 years of marriage that awaited her, there is one more thing you need to understand about the woman who stood in that doorway all night watching. Servilia was 60 years old when she supervised Flavia's wedding night. She had performed this role for more than 200 brides over 3 decades. She was respected. She was sought after. Families paid handsomely for her services because her testimony carried weight in court. But 40 years before she stood in that doorway, Servilia had been 20. She had been a bride. She had worn the flammeum. She had walked the torchlit path. She had stood before a wooden statue in a lamplit room while a different pronuba gripped her arm and a different physician waited with his instruments. Servilia had been Flavia. Every pronuba had been. Every woman who stood in that doorway watching and verifying and testifying had once stood on the other side, had once been the girl in the veil, had once felt her heart pound as the cloth was pulled back, had once heard the whispered warning from her mother. The path from bride to pronuba was not random. It was a career trajectory that Roman society recognized and rewarded. A woman who endured her own wedding night with dignity, who bore children successfully, who managed her husband's household without complaint, who survived long enough to become a widow or a respected matron, could parlay that experience into social authority. The pronuba role was one of the few positions of genuine power available to Roman women. But the price of that power was complicity. To become a pronuba, you had to believe, or at least to act as though you believed that the system you had survived was necessary and good. You had to stand in that doorway and watch another girl endure what you had endured and call it proper procedure. You had to grip another girl's arm and guide her toward the statue and call it sacred tradition. Some pronubas may have felt nothing. Decades of repetition can flatten any experience into routine. But some must have remembered. Some must have looked at the bride's face and seen their own reflection from 40 years ago. Some must have heard the girl's breathing quicken and remembered the sound of their own terror. And they performed their role anyway, because the alternative was admitting that what had been done to them was wrong. And if it was wrong, then everything that followed from it, the marriage, the children, the life they had built on that foundation, was built on something monstrous. The system sustained itself partly through denial. To question the ritual was to question the legitimacy of every marriage it had consecrated, including your own. This is how the system perpetuated itself. Not through male violence alone, not through law alone, but through the transformation of victims into operators. The women who had endured the ritual became the women who administered the ritual. They did this not because they were cruel, but because they believed with the absolute certainty of experience that they were protecting the next generation. Because Servilia knew what happened to brides whose rituals were improperly conducted. She had seen marriages challenged in court because the pronuba's testimony was insufficient. She had seen women return to their fathers' houses in disgrace because a physician's examination raised questions about compliance. She had seen families destroyed by procedural failures. In Servilia's understanding, her firm hand on Flavia's arm was not restraint. It was protection. Her steady voice was not coercion. It was guidance. She was ensuring that every step was completed properly so that no one could ever challenge Flavia's status as a legitimate wife. The system had transformed a victim into its most dedicated enforcer, and it had done so by convincing her that enforcement was love. This is the most efficient machine of control ever devised. Not one that requires guards and chains and walls, but one that turns the people it crushes into the people who operate it. A system that runs on the willing participation of its own victims who have been taught to believe that what was done to them was necessary and that doing it to others is a kindness. The circle was perfect, unbroken, self-sustaining. It had been turning for 1,000 years. Part 3. The Great Erasure. Year 410 of the Common Era. More than 300 years after Flavia Tirsa stood trembling before a wooden statue in a lamplit room. A Christian bishop named Aurelius stands in a storage chamber beneath a church that was once a pagan temple. Around him, arranged on shelves and stacked against walls, are dozens of wooden figures. Mutunus, tutunus, in every size, every style, every degree of craftsmanship. Some are crude, carved by village artisans for families who could not afford the polished masterworks used by Rome's elite. Some are exquisitely detailed dark wood rubbed smooth by centuries of use, their surfaces carrying the ghost touch of 1,000 brides. These figures were confiscated over the past decade from private homes, temple collections, and storage houses throughout the city. Christian authorities had been methodical about it. They knew where to look because the women of Rome told them. Converts to the new faith, women who had experienced the old rituals and who now understood them through the lens of Christian theology, as abominations came forward and told the bishops where the statues were hidden. This detail matters. The women who helped destroy the evidence of their own violation were not acting out of simple religious obedience. Many of them had carried the memory of what was done to them for decades in silence, without any framework for understanding it as wrong. Roman culture offered no such framework. The ritual was tradition. It was sacred. It was what all brides endured. There was no word for what it actually was because the culture had deliberately avoided creating one. Christianity gave these women for the first time a vocabulary for naming what had happened to them. It told them their bodies were temples of the Holy Spirit, not property to be inspected. It told them that modesty was a virtue, not a limitation to be overridden by ritual. It told them that what was done to them in those lamplit rooms was not sacred tradition, but pagan obscenity. For some women, conversion was not merely a spiritual transformation. It was the first time anyone had told them they had the right to be outraged. That their outrage was then harnessed to serve the political agenda of a new religious power does not make the outrage less real. It merely demonstrates how effectively systems of control can recruit genuine emotion to serve institutional purposes. Aurelius examines the collection with the expression of a man surveying an enemy's weapons after a decisive battle. Satisfaction, perhaps a trace of revulsion. Certainly no doubt about what must be done. He gives the order, destroy them all. But understand this clearly. Aurelius was not liberating women. He was not moved by compassion for the thousands of brides who had endured the ritual. He was not advocating for female autonomy or dignity or consent. He was a soldier in a theological war, and these statues were enemy artifacts. They represented a rival system of belief, a rival claim on the bodies and souls of Roman citizens. The old system said women were property to be verified through physical inspection. The new system said women were souls to be governed through spiritual authority. The mechanism changed, the control did not. When Christianity transformed Rome over the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, it brought genuinely different premises to the question of marriage. If women possessed souls equal to men before God, then the most extreme forms of treating them as livestock became theologically untenable. If marriage was a sacred mystery ordained by God rather than a property contract between families, then the apparatus of inspection and verification was not just unnecessary. It was offensive to the divine. If modesty and privacy were Christian virtues, then the entire system of witness consummation of open doors and observing pronubas and documented examinations was an affront to everything the new faith taught about the proper ordering of intimate life. These were real changes, and for some women in some ways they represented genuine improvement. The end of the mutunis tutunis ritual meant that brides were no longer subjected to that particular violation. The emphasis on marital privacy meant that the wedding night, at least in theory, became a matter between husband and wife rather than a public performance. But the transformation was never as complete as the church claimed, and the motivation was never as pure as it appeared. The Christians who dismantled Rome's pagan marriage system did not do so because they believed women deserved better. They did so because they needed to replace one system of authority with another. The old system located authority in Roman law, in the father, in the husband, in the machinery of contracts and witnesses and medical verification. The new system relocated authority to the church, to God, to priests who would bless marriages, define their terms, and enforce their rules. Women gained privacy. They lost legal protections that Roman law, for all its brutality, had actually provided. Under the old system, a Roman woman of the late Republic and imperial period could own property, initiate divorce, and conduct business independently. These rights, limited and imperfect as they were, had been built into the same legal framework that treated marriage as property transfer. When that framework was dismantled, many of these rights were dismantled with it. The irony is staggering. The pagan system that treated women as property also gave them property rights. The Christian system that declared women had souls equal to men proceeded to restrict their legal autonomy in ways that would persist for over 1,000 years. A Roman woman of the 2nd century had more economic freedom than an English woman of the 18th century. The system that inspected her body on her wedding night also allowed her to own businesses and initiate divorce. The system that declared her body sacred also declared her mind insufficient for legal, commercial, and political participation. History does not move in straight lines toward justice. It moved sideways, trading one form of control for another, gaining ground in one area while losing it in another. The women of Rome lost the statue and the physician's examination. They gained the confessional and the moral police of a church that would burn women as witches for another 1,200 years. What the church built in its place was a system in which a woman's value was measured not by her fertility or her father's negotiating skill, but by her spiritual purity. Virginity transformed from a legal condition to be verified by physicians into a moral condition to be policed by priests. The examination table was replaced by the confessional. The pronuba's watchful eyes were replaced by the priest's authority to interrogate the conscience. The means of control changed, the fact of control continued, but the erasure was real, and it was thorough. The campaign to eliminate physical evidence of Rome's pagan marriage practices was systematic and sustained over generations. Statues of Mutunus Tutunus were smashed, burned, or buried in foundation fills, where archaeologists would not discover them for 1,500 years. Texts describing wedding night rituals in clinical detail were removed from libraries. Scrolls were allowed to decay, copies were not made. When manuscripts were transcribed by monks who preserved so much of classical literature, the passages describing these practices were quietly omitted. Wall paintings that depicted traditional wedding night scenes were whitewashed or chiseled off. The plaster fragments that survive found in the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, where volcanic ash preserved what Christian hammers could not reach, show enough to confirm what the literary sources describe. But most were destroyed. The pronuba's role was the most telling transformation. This woman who had served as a legal officer, whose testimony carried the force of law, whose presence was required for a marriage to be considered valid, was gradually reduced to a ceremonial figure, a matron of honor, a friend of the bride who helped arrange her veil and offered encouraging words. The sharp-eyed witness who had watched consummations and documented examinations became a smiling woman who threw flowers and wished the couple well. Consider the magnitude of this transformation. A professional role that required decades of experience, a spotless reputation, and the legal authority to testify in court was reduced within a few generations to a sentimental position with no legal function whatsoever. It is as though the entire profession of property law was replaced overnight by greeting card writers. The substance was stripped away, the form was preserved, and the empty form was presented as a tradition as though it had always been this way. This pattern repeated across every aspect of Roman wedding practice. The torch-lit procession survived but lost its association with the deflowering that waited at its end. The scattering of walnuts survived but lost its connection to the fertility rituals that gave them meaning. The carrying of the bride across the threshold survived but lost its memory of an era when women were taken by force. The white of the bridal garment, which in Rome had been the saffron of the flammeum, eventually became associated with purity and innocence, rather than with the ritual verification of that purity through physical examination. Every element of the modern Western wedding carries the DNA of what Rome actually practiced, but the DNA has been so thoroughly overwritten that almost no one recognizes the original code. Within 3 or 4 generations, detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings actually involved was lost to everyone except scholars studying fragmentary sources that most people would never read. The comfortable myth replaced the uncomfortable reality. Saffron veils and scattered walnuts and joyful processions became the story of Roman marriage. The wooden statues and the physician's instruments and the open doors and the watching eyes were forgotten. The Christians who transformed Rome were not simply erasing embarrassing history. They were building a new civilization on Roman foundations, while denying what those foundations actually supported. They succeeded so well that most people living today, even educated people, even people who consider themselves knowledgeable about Roman history, have no idea what Roman marriage really involved. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. No erasure is ever total. Augustine's outrage preserved what he sought to condemn. By describing the Mutunus Tutunus ritual in order to attack paganism, he inadvertently created the most detailed surviving account of a practice he wanted destroyed. Lactantius's refusal to describe the details because they were too shameful to name tells us by its very intensity that what he refused to describe was far more than a symbolic gesture. Arnobius's clinical language provides the physical specifics that the others avoided. And Varro's careful euphemisms written centuries before Christianity confirm that these practices were ancient, established, and universally understood. Enough pieces remain to reconstruct what happened in those lamplit rooms. Enough evidence survives to understand what Roman brides actually experienced. And enough silence surrounds it all to remind us that the stories we have inherited about the past were selected by the victors, shaped by their purposes, and stripped of everything they found inconvenient. Now let us return to Flavia. Flavia Tirsa was a Roman wife for 42 years. She lived from approximately the year 71 of the Common Era to the year 131. She bore 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, all of whom survived to adulthood. This was remarkable in an age when child mortality claimed nearly half of all those born. She managed her husband's household with the competence expected of a Roman matron. She attended festivals, honored the gods, supervised slaves, maintained the social connections that her husband's business required. She fulfilled every duty that Roman society placed upon its women. Marcus Petronius Rufus proved to be neither cruel nor kind. He was a practical man who had married for practical reasons. He needed heirs. Flavia provided them. He needed a household manager. Flavia became one. Whatever happened between them in the years after that first night, whether affection grew or mere tolerance settled in the historical record, does not tell us. Marcus died in the year 118, leaving Flavia a widow at approximately 47 years old. She received her portion of the estate as the marriage contracts had specified. She lived independently in Rome for another 13 years, managing her own finances, overseeing the marriages of her children. She had more freedom as a widow than she had ever possessed as a daughter or a wife. This is one of the cruel paradoxes of Roman womanhood. The system that treated women as property during marriage also provided through the mechanism of widowhood a narrow window of genuine autonomy. A widow with resources and no living father could conduct business, manage property, and make decisions about her own life in ways that married women could not. Some Roman widows became formidable figures in commerce and social life precisely because marriage had trained them in household management, while widowhood finally gave them authority over their own affairs. Flavia used this freedom quietly. She did not remarry, though she received offers. She had fulfilled her obligation. She had produced the required heirs. She had no desire to submit to another husband's authority or to walk another torch-lit path to another man's house. The system had no further use for her, and in that uselessness, she found something like peace. But twice in those 42 years of marriage, Flavia faced a moment that tested whether the system had truly consumed her or whether something inside her had survived. Her daughter Tertia was the older of her 2 girls. Born in the year 95 of the Common Era, Tertia grew into a healthy young woman who resembled her mother in coloring and temperament. She had her mother's wide hips, her mother's good teeth, her mother's quiet manner, that men of property interpreted as compliance. By the time Tertia was 15, Flavia and Marcus had begun negotiations for her marriage. The prospective groom was a young magistrate from a family with political ambitions. The match was better than the one Gaius had secured for Flavia. Marcus's wealth and connections had raised the family's position. Tertia would marry higher than her mother had. But higher meant more elaborate rituals, more witnesses, more scrutiny, a pronuba of even greater reputation, a physician of even more exacting standards. Higher meant worse. On the morning of Tertia's wedding, Flavia went to her daughter's room to arrange the bridal hair. 6 braids, wool ribbons, the tip of a ceremonial spear to part the hair. Every step the same, every gesture identical to what Cornelia had performed for Flavia 26 years earlier. And as Flavia wound the 6th braid and reached for the final ribbon, the same thing happened. She began to cry. The same deep shuddering sobs. The same desperate attempt to muffle the sound. The same breaking open of something that had been sealed shut for decades. Tertia was alarmed. She had never seen her mother lose composure. "Mother, what is wrong?" And Flavia heard the question and understood that she was standing exactly where Cornelia had stood, that she was weeping the same tears, that in a few hours her daughter would walk the same torchlit path, stand before the same kind of wooden figure, in another lamplit room, feel the same pronuba's grip on her arm, hear the same physician open his bag of instruments. And Flavia heard herself say the words, "Do not resist. Whatever they require of you tonight, do not resist. It only makes everything worse." The same words, the exact same words, passed from Cornelia to Flavia, now from Flavia to Tertia. 3 generations of women linked by a whispered warning that was the closest any of them would ever come to speaking about what they had endured. Flavia had not planned to say it. She had not rehearsed it. She had not spent the preceding weeks deciding how to prepare her daughter. The words came out of her the way blood comes from a wound involuntarily, unstoppably, from a place so deep that conscious thought had no authority over it. And in that moment, Flavia understood her mother for the first time. She understood that Cornelia's tears had not been weakness. They had been recognition. The recognition that you are watching your daughter walk toward the same destruction you survived, and the only tool you have to protect her is a whisper that tells her not to fight. Turia looked at her mother with the same confusion that Flavia had felt 26 years earlier. The same desire to understand, the same inability to imagine what those words actually meant. She would understand tonight. And 20 years after that, Tertia would braid her own daughter's hair, and she would weep, and she would whisper the same words. Because the inheritance was not knowledge. The inheritance was not even the warning. The inheritance was the silence that surrounded the warning, the vast unspoken territory of experience that no Roman woman would ever map, that no Roman woman would ever describe, that existed only in the space between a mother's tears and a daughter's bewilderment. This was the inheritance, not the dowry, not the wedding veil, not the contracts or the ceremonies or the public celebrations. The real inheritance was this whisper, this preparation, this passing of knowledge from mother to daughter in words so careful they barely existed, words that warned without explaining, that prepared without describing, that acknowledged a shared experience while maintaining the silence that society demanded. Cornelia never told Flavia what would happen. She only told her not to resist. Flavia never told Tertia what would happen. She only told her not to resist. And Tertia 20 years later would braid her own daughter's hair and weep and whisper the same words. The system did not perpetuate itself only through law and ritual. It perpetuated itself through love, through the fierce, helpless, devastating love of mothers who could not protect their daughters from what was coming, but could at least prepare them to survive it. The warning was an act of love. Do not resist was not surrender. It was survival advice passed down through generations by women who knew from personal experience that resistance only brought worse consequences. And this is perhaps the cruelest achievement of the system. It weaponized the strongest human emotion against the people who felt it most. It made maternal love into an instrument of compliance. It ensured that the people most motivated to protect young women, their own mothers, became the people who prepared those women for submission. A mother who warned her daughter was loving her daughter. A mother who explained what would happen, who armed her daughter with knowledge and defiance, risked destroying her daughter's future. The system made love and silence the same thing. It made protection and compliance the same thing. And it sustained itself for 1,000 years on the backs of women who loved their daughters too much to let them resist. This is what makes the silence so complete and so terrible. These women were not silent because they did not care. They were silent because they cared too much. Because the only way to protect their daughters was to prepare them for compliance. Because speaking openly about what the ritual involved might have given a daughter grounds for refusal, and refusal would have destroyed her. The love and the silence were inseparable. Each required the other, and together they maintained the system more effectively than any law or any threat. Flavia Tirsa died in the year 131 of the Common Era. She was approximately 60 years old. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. The histories were written by men. The legal texts were written by men. The philosophical treatises and the medical manuals and the religious commentaries, all written by men for men about the concerns of men. We know what the priest said at her wedding. We know what the contracts specified about her dowry. We know what the physician documented about her body. We know what the pronoba testified about her wedding night. We have records of the property she inherited after Marcus died and the transactions she conducted as a widow. We have documentation of everything that was done to Flavia Tirsa, and everything that Flavia Tirsa owned, and everything that Flavia Tirsa produced for the men who controlled her life. What we do not have is a single word in Flavia's own voice. Not one sentence telling us what she felt when the cloth was pulled back. Not one line describing what it was like to lie on that bed with the door open and a stranger's eyes watching from the doorway. Not one paragraph about the morning after when she woke in an unfamiliar room, in an unfamiliar house, married to an unfamiliar man, her body documented and filed and officially transferred. The Roman Empire, which preserved tax records from provincial grain shipments and disciplinary reports from frontier garrisons and personal correspondence between bureaucrats arguing about the price of olive oil, did not preserve a single document written by a woman about her own wedding night. The record-keeping civilization, the civilization that documented everything, documented nothing about this. That absence is not an accident. It is the final piece of the system. The machine that processed women's bodies also erased women's voices. The same civilization that required witnesses and physicians and documentation for the physical transaction required absolute silence about the human experience of that transaction. What Flavia thought about her wedding night in the 42 years that followed, we cannot know. Did she remember it as trauma, as acceptance, as something in between that had no name because her language provided no words for the experience of being treated as property by people who believed they were honoring tradition? Did she wish something different for her daughters? Or did she accept, as her mother had accepted, as her grandmother had accepted, that this was simply how things were? The silence surrounding these practices is not the silence of conspiracy. It is the silence of something so deeply embedded in a civilization that describing it seemed as pointless as describing the act of breathing. Everyone knew. No one spoke of it. The rituals were the water that Roman women swam in, so omnipresent that they were invisible. For 1,000 years, this was what marriage meant in Rome. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework, understood their experiences through this lens, passed their knowledge to their daughters in whispers, and then fell silent. The system perpetuated itself because everyone accepted its fundamental premises. Property must be verified. Transfers must be witnessed. Marriage creates legal obligations requiring documentation. Women are the medium through which families continue. The logic was internally consistent even as it was externally monstrous. And here is the uncomfortable truth that the erasure was designed to hide. Rome is the civilization we claim as our ancestor, the foundation of Western law, the model we built upon, the society we reference when we want to invoke the grandeur and sophistication of the past. We name our government buildings after Roman architecture. We model our legal system on Roman precedent. We teach our children that Rome was the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of democracy and justice and the rule of law. We put Roman columns on our courthouses and Roman eagles on our currency and Roman words in our legal codes. And we never mention what Rome did to its women on their wedding nights. We never discuss the statues or the physicians or the open doors or the watching eyes. We never acknowledge that the legal system we celebrate as our heritage included at its core the systematic reduction of half the population to inspected, documented, verified property. Acknowledging what Rome actually did to its women complicates that inheritance in ways that most people would prefer to avoid. It suggests that civilization and systematic cruelty can coexist, that legal sophistication can serve as the instrument of dehumanization rather than its remedy, that a society can build aqueducts and write philosophy and create enduring art while treating half its population as property to be inspected and documented and transferred. The wedding night rituals of Rome are gone. The statues have been smashed. The texts have been burned or forgotten. The pronuba has become the maid of honor. The physician's examination has been replaced by the expectation of trust. But the women who experienced those rituals were real. Flavia Tersa was real. Her mother Cornelia was real. Her daughter Tertia was real. The pronuba Servilia, who had once been a terrified bride herself before becoming the system's most reliable operator, was real. The physician Quintus, who examined women's bodies with the same professional detachment he would bring to inspecting livestock, was real. The 3 slaves who stood in the corridor and saw everything and whose testimony counted for nothing, they were real. Every one of the thousands of brides who passed through this system across 1,000 years of Roman civilization was real. Each one had a name. Each one had a mother who wept while braiding her hair. Each one heard the whispered warning. Each one walked the torch-lit path through streets, yards full of strangers singing obscene songs about what was about to happen to her. Each one stood before a wooden statue in a lamplit room and understood for the first time what Roman marriage actually meant. And each one afterward fell silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because the civilization that processed her body had no interest in hearing her voice. For 1,000 years, generation after generation of Roman women walked barefoot across cold marble toward wooden figures in lamplit rooms. They submitted to examinations. They endured witness consummations. They emerged as wives whose value had been legally verified and whose bodies had been officially documented as transferred property. And then they never spoke of it again. Their silence lasted centuries. It lasted through the fall of Rome. It lasted through the rise of Christianity. It lasted through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and every era that followed, each one building on the foundation that Rome had laid while forgetting what that foundation actually held. But silence is not erasure, and forgotten is not gone. The fragments survive. The pieces can be assembled. The story can be told. They lived. They endured. They were silenced. But now, 2,000 years later, someone is finally listening. Because the past is never truly dead. It is only waiting. Waiting in the silence between what we remember and what we chose to forget. Waiting in the fragments that survived the flames. Waiting for someone to ask the question that no one wanted asked. What really happened on a Roman wedding night? Now you know. And now you understand why they tried so hard to make sure you never would. If this reached you, subscribe. We dig into the chapters history tried to erase. The voices that were meant to stay silent forever. Because the past is not dead. It is just waiting in the dark. Waiting for someone to find it. Waiting for someone to listen. And waiting for someone brave enough to tell the truth about what civilization really means and what it has always cost. The silence is broken now. It took 2,000 years. But silence, no matter how long it lasts, is never the final word. Someone always remembers. Something always survives. And the truth buried beneath centuries of deliberate forgetting has a way of clawing itself back into the light. This was their story. It was always their story. We just were not allowed to hear it until now.